have all the stuff. You just need to start from zero.
Let's prioritize what we have to have. There's a lot of old programs. There's a lot of problems that we have in that. When we do that, and then let's look at, you're seeing a government shutdown conversation that's happening right now. And it's a false narrative to say that the Freedom Caucus is holding things hostage because they want to cut, or do you allow the government to go forward? First of all, you cut and you allow the government to go forward. You can have both, not either or. Think about this. Congress has proposed a budget on time 4 times in 40 years. 4 times in 40 years. We have to go back to no budget, no pay. If Congress can't produce a budget, Congress doesn't get paid. We should not be in this scenario, but because they wait and they don't work and they don't produce results, we end up in the same situation over and over again. That'll stop when I'm president.
It's also been shown that government shutdowns hurt both parties. Have you talked to leadership at all, particularly as you guys are headed into the second presidential debate?
I haven't talked to leadership. I've talked to all of Congress saying it is irresponsible and inexcusable that you would let government shut down.
And what's the response?
It is also irresponsible and inexcusable to not cut all of this spending. They are using our budget and keeping it in pandemic spending. We're no longer in a pandemic. Why are they still spending at those levels? Taxpayers can't afford it.
So what's their response when you say, guys, get it together?
I mean, they need to get in a room and figure it out. We're going to find out, I guess.
But are you worried that this is going to harm the party?
This is going to harm taxpayers. It's not about the party. Taxpayers already can't afford groceries and gas. They can't afford buying a home or buying a car. And now you're going to say, oh, we can't figure it out. We're going to shut down government. That's not okay. You don't get to do that. Instead, you have to start cutting what you spend. Why is it everybody in this room balances a budget? I balanced a budget as governor of South Carolina. Why is Congress the only group that refuses to balance a budget? It's the reason we have to have term limits in Washington, but it's also the reason we need them to start doing their job. Taxpayers and businesses work for government right now. So government's got to start working for them.
So let's circle back to the everyday American. And Governor DeSantis talked about pledging to get gasoline prices to $2 in his first year. You talk about scrapping the gas tax and the diesel tax. Do you think we can get to $2 a gallon? Like, would you support that? How would you do that?
Well, I didn't propose that.
Right, but he did. So would you match it?
I don't support what he proposes. Okay, so I came out with my own.
So that wouldn't be something that you could commit to?
No. I mean, I think what we do is we focus on the taxpayers. How do we get more cash in the taxpayer's pocket? Let's eliminate the federal gas tax and diesel tax, and let's start coming up with an infrastructure plan that can manage what we need in the next decades going forward. That's the focus I'm going to do. I'm going to focus on strengthening the middle class. That's where we have to focus. Right now, we're watching in America where the poor are getting poorer and the rich are getting richer, and we are losing that middle class. We're going to focus on the middle class.
Well, considering that $2 gasoline means like $45 oil, everyone here is pretty happy that you are going to support that one, I bet. Okay, so you talk a lot about China as really the crux of China then becoming your economic policy, right? Like combating China, how do you manage that? If we're all going to eventually transition and get to cleaner fuel, how do we flex our muscle in China and India to get them to also reduce it? How do you do that?
So, by winning. And so I'll tell you the first thing that we need to do in terms of with China and Russia is let's take India. They have millions of people right now without electricity. They need clean, cheap electricity that they can start doing with their country. They have doubled the number of coal-producing plants that they have, which is a problem. That's why we need to be doing more in America. We need to be exporting as much liquefied natural gas as we can. India is going to be a friend of ours. India is worried about China. They just gave themselves $1 billion stimulus to become less dependent on China. Let's partner with them. So not only are we exporting liquefied natural gas to the Europeans, let's do it to India as well. That's when it's a win-win. We have it, let's share it. That's the goal, and that's how we would handle India. With China, you beat them. What I saw at the United Nations, there were 2 things our enemies never wanted us to have. They never wanted us to have a strong military, and they never wanted us to be energy independent. Let's be energy dominant. That's how you defeat China.
What energy dominance? Like what of the energy mix? All the stuff?
Well, it
Just
should
oil
be-
and gas?
So I think we should be all of the above energy, while also focusing on innovation that allows us to continue to be cleaner and safer in that process. The problem is when you start picking what kinds of energy, that's when you're picking winners and losers. Let's do all of it. I want us to be energy dominant. I don't ever want us to have to lean on an enemy or have to be dependent on a foreign country for our energy needs, not when we're this blessed.
And you're one of the only ones up there that talk about actual climate change. So you are a proponent of wind and solar. Like, you want them all. What would be a good energy mix for you after your first term?
Well, first of all, I do think that climate change is real. I think we have to acknowledge that it's real. But I also don't think we go so extreme that we say we have to do all these things by X year. Instead, that's where the partnership in this room comes. They know innovation better than anyone else. We know what we can do to start finding those ways of capturing carbon, of making sure that we do the fusion so that we can start getting a net energy plus in the process. These things are starting to come out. Now let's just go and make that happen. But yes, I believe in wind, I believe in solar, I believe in all of those things because I think all of those are part of how we become healthier as an environment and healthier in teaching the countries around the world what else we're doing.
At the end of your first term, how much of the energy mix is renewables? How much does it grow by?
I don't think that's for me to decide. I think that's for the industry to decide. That's where we have to come together. We have to say, what can we do that's safe, that's clean, that's affordable, that helps taxpayers? The problem is you need to have a president that understands you've got to have an energy community that's going to say, well, this is what we can do, or we can propose this, or let's pull this innovation in. Right now, you're treating them like second-class citizens. They're experts. We need to use the experts. And if I go and say, this is how we want to make sure we reduce emissions, how do we get there? This is the group that tells us how we get there, not government bureaucrats, not regulators. They're not going to tell you how to get there. They're just going to squeeze you to the point that you don't have energy to start with.
You got a lot of attention there when you said that. When you're taking a look at, say, unleashing the energy dominance, right? Labor is still a really big problem. I was talking to Doug Lawler of Continental, and he's like, labor's just still really tight. So even if you wanted to sort of innovate and pump a lot of money into stuff, you can't. We don't have the labor for it. How do you get there? How do you get skilled, quality labor to this industry?
Well, you always have to. In South Carolina, we went from a state that was making textiles that all went overseas, and we had to get used to, when I recruited in, we were then building planes and cars and tires, and we had to retrain our workforce. And the way we did that was we worked through our technical schools to start focusing on the new jobs that we had and how we could get them back on track. We need to do that. We need to make sure that we're filling the jobs that we need. And you do that by reskilling. And then you also look at the fact that while we're looking to close the border, and we need to close the border because there's more lawlessness that we've seen in a long time, you also look at legal immigration. And when you look at legal immigration, we have to stop the way that we do quotas based on numbers. We'll take X number this year, X number next year, and start saying, what do our industries need that they can't fill? So think construction, think farming, think tourism, think energy production, and then you bring it based on merit. When you bring it based on merit, that's when you build up our economy, instead of just focusing on what quota you're going to deal with from one year to the next.
We only have a few minutes left, so a minute left. I just wanted to ask you about your path. So we have the second debate coming this week. What is your path? If Iowa doesn't go your way, for example, what is the Nikki Haley path now? What's the Nikki Haley path in 2028?
Well, you're assuming that Iowa won't go my way.
No, I'm really not. I'm saying you got to have lots of plans. There got to be a spreadsheet there with lots of things going on.
I have one plan. We have done
I set her up for that.
85 events in Iowa, New Hampshire. We continue to do big events in South Carolina. The momentum is real. We're pushing hard. We're raising money, and we are we're putting ourselves out there in the debates, and the support is strong. And so our goal is to have a strong showing in Iowa, have a strong showing in New Hampshire, have a strong showing in South Carolina, and finish this all the way through. We have to make sure that we don't end up with a President Kamala Harris. And right now, we are going down the path of getting a President Kamala Harris, and that should worry every single American. So if we're gonna do that, the only way we win is with a new generational leader. I have had executive experience as a 2-term governor. I've got foreign policy experience from having been at the United Nations negotiating with 193 countries. I know what we need to do to make America strong and proud again. I'm not gonna stop until we get there.
Can a moderate, reasonable Republican win the primaries?
I think you are gonna see a pro-American, tough-talking accountant suddenly go in there and say, you know what, let's get our debt on track, let's control law and order, let's get these borders closed, let's make sure that we get transparency back in the classroom, and let's put China, Russia, and Iran, Venezuela finally in their place so that America can be strong. Yes, I can do that.
Ambassador, thank you. Okay, perfect.
Thank you so much.
Our next session is entitled Meeting Growing Global Demand from a Producer's Supply Perspective. Sharing her insight is the president and CEO of Occidental Petroleum. She also serves as the chair of the World Economic Forum's Oil and Gas Community. Please welcome Vicki Hollub. And joining the discussion is the chairman of the Ham Institute for American Energy, Mr. Harold Ham.
Thanks so much for being with us today. When we talk supply, we thought about who would be the very best person in the world, perhaps, to talk about supply. And it was, quickly, we landed that you're the very right person to do that. So thanks for being with us. We heard about demand this morning. It's going to grow in a lot of different forms. All foreign perhaps, but age-old questions, we got 2 million barrels a day of demand out there, and we'll be able to supply oil and gas into the future. Some people see this U.S. energy renaissance as another boom and bust cycle, a flash in the pan perhaps. From your estimation, your experience, our energy supply is a much longer duration, so give me your opinion on that.
I think that the important thing to remember is that while the supply of hydrocarbons is not infinite, but I think one thing that the U.S. has shown is that we can lead the world in developing new technologies. And we started out with oil production here in the United States in the 1920s, and started with primary production. And I don't have to tell all of you all of the technologies that were developed over the years to improve our recoveries from conventional reservoirs. There was, the secondary recovery. There was seismic that helped made it easier for us to find new reserves. There was then CO2 flooding, which will play a part in the future as well. There was then the thing that you did so well, Harold, the horizontal drilling and fracking. So I think that there's still more technology to come. And while I think that the shale revolution was something that was probably the most dramatic, I think the next technologies that come along will be applied to both the conventional and unconventional. And I believe certainly in the Gulf of Mexico, that's going to be artificial intelligence. I think there's still a lot to be discovered and developed and produced there. I also think that with the shale, there's no way that the U.S. oil and gas industry is going to accept only recovering 10 to 12% of the oil in the shale. We're going to get more than that. And again, CO2 will be applied to the shale too. We intend to do that and have done some tests on it. But I think nanotechnology may be something that helps us with the shale. So while we've already produced a lot, and the EIA thinks that we've produced probably 90% of the conventional reserves in the U.S., that recovery of conventional is less than 50%. So there's still more to be gained there. Shale probably still of the 26 million that we've produced to date, I think there's still 3 times that potentially to go. And so I think that with incremental technologies, we still got a lot to produce here in the United States.
Well, thank you. You know, everybody talks 2050. You know, that's usually past everybody's retirement, so it's easy to talk about it. But looking at 2050 then, with these advancements that you see in the future, do you think we can adequately supply oil and gas to 2050?
I think that 2050 is going to require technologies that we're not thinking about today. But I do think that can happen, and I think that gets more to the nanotechnologies. If you take just what we have today, we're probably looking at being able to provide what the U.S. needs for the next 20 years or so. But you know, the U.S. production has been written off in the past. I remember in the Permian, when my predecessor actually, Steve Chazen, bought the Altura assets, which were the the CO2 floods in the Permian. He was hammered about it because everybody said he was buying harvest mode assets. But guess what? We're still adding reserves to those same assets today. And so more than 20 years later, we're still doing a really good job with getting more reserves out. So I think it's just going to take something that we haven't really thought about today or haven't conceived of, but I think that the hydrocarbons will certainly be in the ground, and what we got to do now is just engineer them out as we've done in the past.
Okay, thank you. You know, let's just break it down, talk both oil and gas, and, you know, as a geologist, I kind of look at gas as you being ubiquitous. It's everywhere, but well, what's your opinion on oil? You're saying 20 years, but we're pretty good. What about natural gas? What do you see there?
Natural gas there's, I think, an overabundance of natural gas in the United States. I think you can't develop it all at $2.50. That's not going to do it. But what we have coming up is, and what we've invested in here at Occidental is we're equity investors in a company called Net Power. I believe Net Power could revolutionize the power industry in the United States, and it will do it using natural gas. So what that technology does is it combusts natural gas with oxygen instead of air. So the emissions there are no volatile organic emissions. It captures the CO2 as a part of the process. So the CO2 drives the turbine. So you get water as an output, and CO2 is captured as a stream coming off of it that you can then use in enhanced oil recovery or use to make other products. So I believe the combination of the abundance of natural gas here in the United States that otherwise wouldn't be developed without this kind of technology, I believe this technology will drive gas development long into the future. And we just hired Toby Rice to be the CEO of the Net Power company that we've invested in. So that we're advancing that, and we're trying to make sure people are more aware of that. It also means that with that kind of emission-free technology, there's no reason to feel like you have to be totally dependent on renewables. So this is a very good complement to the renewables that have been developed to date. But as you know, this would be uninterruptible power. So this is much more important for the grid going forward.
So this environmental friendly process, basically the general population, nobody's thinking about that, right?
Nobody's thinking about this. It's almost too like I go in and I will meet with people. I'll tell them about this, and they think, oh yeah, that's okay. And then Toby goes in and he talks to people about it, and they go, oh my God, that's great technologies. So I think it's just a matter of time before we get this out and for people realize that it can be developed. We'll be building the first one of these in the Permian in 2015.
Wow, great.
2025, I'm sorry. I'm not going back in time.
Yeah, 2025. We've seen, so much of the world's needs being delivered by LNG today. how much of the future needs can the U.S. provide of LNG deliveries to our allies and around the world?
I think our European allies definitely are going to need it. Europe certainly needs to move to something that's more reliable than what they have today. And so we know the need is there. Since the need is there, I think the price will be there to make LNG exports to Europe much more valuable for the U.S. companies. So I do think there's going to be a supply. I think the competing need for the use of the gas here in the United States is going to make Europe pay a bit more for it than they are paying today, though.
Okay, so I guess to break it down, you see this as not only an economic driver for the U.S., but also producers and the whole value chain.
Yeah, the whole value chain will benefit from the technologies that are being developed, that net power around gas, and what I believe will be further breakthroughs in the production of oil as well.
Good. I'm looking forward to the LNG panel in a little bit. That's very exciting. So, you know, I think everybody's aware that the air is much cleaner today, but what you've seen the numbers on what we've done with clean burning natural gas. So what do you see those numbers being today as far as how we've cleaned up the air in the U.S.?
Well, certainly the emissions in the United States have declined dramatically, and part of that has been the shift to natural gas. I think that we still are in a situation where we do need to work on reduction of methane in all of our operations, and most companies are doing that in a big way. Part of it is just to redesign facilities so that we reduce or eliminate to the degree that we can the emission points and the leak points. But I think that the move to natural gas was a significant move, and the next big step change is going to be, again, this new technology and kind of a redesign of how we produce our oil and gas.
Should we expect perhaps eventually to see that same reduction around the world as we export more LNG, perhaps?
I think that there should come a time when the world bases decisions on the carbon intensity of products, and certainly the carbon intensity of the U.S. gas, and ultimately what I believe will be the lower carbon intensity of our oil production should be an attractive product for the world. I think that we're not at the point yet where people understand the carbon intensity of all the various technologies that are being either used or proposed for the climate transition. If we all knew that carbon intensity, I think decisions would be made differently. And so we're working, our company's trying to work with third parties, trying to help put in place that independent source of carbon intensity calculations, and also the certification of credits from an agency that will track the molecule of CO2 from the reservoir to the end use. And when you include the upstream supply chain, then you start to probably eliminate or at least reduce some of the technologies that are being most pushed today, because I agree with what was said earlier. The climate transition, as many people view it today, is completely unaffordable. It's not only unaffordable, it would leave too many countries behind, too many people behind. We can't have a technology, we can't live the quality of life we live today and not allow other countries to try to achieve the same quality of living that we have. So we've got to rethink the climate transition, and we can't push that though. We can't really make the right decisions happen until that carbon intensity calculation exists and is available to everybody.
Good, good. You're involved in the Permian, and due to your leadership, you insisted early times that Occidental be there. So what did you see there, that made you determine that the company need to be focused on the Permian?
My predecessor had the view that, that the conventional CO2 reservoirs were worth buying, and I said earlier, got accused about it. I felt like, from what I view in the Permian, is such stacked pay, and we talk a lot about the shale right now, but there's still conventional reservoirs that could be CO2 flooded, and just the properties that we have today. We have, our reserves about 3.8 billion, but there's still 2 billion incremental in just what we have today in the Permian of reserves that could be recovered with CO2. There's a massive amount of conventional reservoirs in the Permian, where you could apply CO2 as well as the shale. We've done 4 pilots on the shale in the Midland Basin, and this is why I did the Anadarko acquisition. I felt like one of the best basins in the world to be in was the Permian. And now with the position that we have tremendous opportunity to apply CO2 to the additional shale reservoirs. And if you look at it closely, there's a deep Ellenberger, which also has significant gas available. So it's, and somebody said earlier about the storage, CO2 storage capacity of the Bakken. Permian as well has significant CO2 storage capacity. So you combine the two in the United States, there's a lot that we can do to reduce our carbon footprint here. And I hope that most of that CO2 will be used for enhanced oil recovery and not just sequestration.
Good, yeah. It's a heck of a place. You've been with Oxy 40 years. You're a real job hopper. And, you know, it's a great credit to you, you know, over that period of time. But you've seen a lot of things happen, you know, this energy renaissance that happened, you know, tripling U.S. production and quadrupling natural gas production. What do you think about, I say that the industry has been transformed. Do you see much of the same thing with production techniques and all that? So maybe you could go into any of that you want to.
Yeah, I love our industry. I got into it by accident. I got into it because I kind of flunked out of the music department at the University of Alabama and had to choose an alternative career, which turned out to be oil and gas. And never realized it would take me away from the state of Alabama and much further away from Bryant-Denny Stadium than I'd like to be. But the industry from the very beginning for me was one that had amazing people and people who always had a can-do attitude wherever I've been. That's been the case in our industry. We do not accept defeat. We fight for what we believe, and we've always, I think, done things generally the right way. We just didn't know back then what the wrong way was. And so now I've seen a transformation in the attitude. And I'll have to say what I've been most proud of in the industry are the wildcatters, the ones that take risks, take chances, and do things that others maybe couldn't do, like you. What you've done and the company that you built from your background has been nothing short of amazing, and stories like Harold's in our industry, and people that not only discovered things, built businesses out of nothing, but also started to realize that we now can't be what we used to be. We have to be something different, but our industry has adopted that. And our industry is, you know, while sometimes we'll push back on some things that people, regulations that are trying to be imposed on us because they're driving us in the wrong direction, we usually stand up and we stand up for what's right, and we're trying to push now beyond where we've been. And that now today is making our operations much cleaner than they've ever been, and developing technologies that will help us to continue to make the United States energy independent. And I think the government should be applauding that. It's just a sad situation when we have only some people doing that. Nikki Haley was a great example of who someone who cares about us, who appreciates what we do. But our industry is important to the United States. We provide without energy independence, I'll just say that we wouldn't have security in this country. And our politicians can't lose sight of the fact that unless we're energy independent, we do not control our own destiny.
Thank you. Appreciate the kind words, by the way. So, yeah, the industry has changed. It's not our same old, our daddy's oil field, that's for sure.
No.
It's changed a great deal. Yeah, are there any other technological and innovation breakthroughs that you believe will affect the supply picture in the U.S. long term?
I do believe that our direct air capture technology that we're working on will have an impact. I applaud Chris and Denbury and what they've stepped out and done, and the impact they've had thus far. They've done it for a long time, and Chris worked through some challenging times to have them survive, and we needed them to survive to get to the point where now they're hopefully going to have a bigger impact as we go into the future. But direct air capture, the reason we've adopted that technology is because, and Chris knows this, how hard it is to work with emitters to do point source capture. So our direct air capture technology, I believe, will be the technology that helps us around the world retain our social license to operate. And what we'll do is we'll use giant radial fans. We'll pull air through a contact tower. We'll take the CO2 out of that air using potassium hydroxide, which our chemicals company makes. We're the largest marketer of that in the U.S., second largest in the world. And in the contact tower, PVC will be what makes that mixing happen. And so it'll diffuse it enough to hopefully have a very efficient mixing so that we get the most CO2 out of the air that we can. And then we'll use that CO2 ultimately all in our enhanced oil recovery, both in conventional and shale. We need to do that around the world because, as I said earlier, getting less than 50% out of conventional reservoirs and only 10% out of shale reservoirs is not something, that's not the end point for us, that's not the end game. So CO2 is kind of the next step. It's not the end step either. It's the next step until we develop that more transformational technology that gets us to much higher recoveries in the shale and the conventional. But right now, in our CO2 floods in the Permian, we can get up to almost 80% of the oil in conventional reservoirs. And that's what we need to apply to all the rest of the U.S. Reservoirs that we can and in the world. So I believe that net power for the gas industry, using CO2 enhanced oil recovery, using CO2 from anthropogenic or atmospheric sources around the world makes our industry more relevant and gives us the runway to keep on producing, because it takes more CO2 injected into the reservoir than what the incremental oil produced from that injected CO2 will emit when used. So you end up with net zero oil or net negative oil. Chris is going to talk about this later. He's already doing it in North Dakota. So that's what will help our industry to survive long term and to not only survive but thrive with incremental recovery from existing reservoirs. So that technology is going to be, I think, transformational. And you combine that with what we could do with point source CO2 capture, I think we could offset our carbon footprint.
Well, we still have a lot to do.
We do have a lot to do.
We're not done yet, Rick. One of the outstanding exploration projects in the last 10 years, of course, has been the work done down in Guyana. Do you believe there are other exploration prospects that will happen in the world in the next several years, similar size?
I do believe there are similar size exploration plays like that, and I believe some of them are along that, where both Africa and Europe and the South America, that part that occurred, I believe along both coasts. I think there's more to discover. We have, and in case anybody's interested, we do have a well to drill in offshore Colombia, It sort of looks like Guyana, not sure it will be. It could be gas, could be oil. We used to think we don't want gas, we want oil, but now we'd be fine with gas. But anybody wants or is interested in that, is it okay to do commercials here? We'd be happy to take calls on that.
Well, good. I'm glad we're not done with exploration either. I kind of like that end of it. So, we talked a little bit about EOR, and of course, your company is a leader there, and we see so many of these reservoirs that EOR is not applied to. How do you think that'll benefit future supply as we go forward?
Yeah, so to me, the most ideal reservoir for CO2 use is one where you've got the right pressure and temperature that you can get the CO2 miscible in the oil. That's where you get the most and the best recovery. And so that's where the sequestration will happen really well, because the way you sequester CO2 in an oil reservoir is that the CO2 mixes with the oil and gets into these little micropores. And in the micropores, the oil is trapped and it can't move. So water flooding doesn't move it out. But when you get the CO2 molecule in there to give that, lower the viscosity of that oil and make it bigger, expand the molecule so that it pops out, then CO2 takes that spot. There can't be avoiding the reservoir. CO2 takes that spot. And that's how it's sequestered in the best, CO2 applicable reservoirs. But CO2 can be sequestered in any oil reservoir. And actually today, the more inefficient it is, the better, because the more volume sequestered, but while it still produces oil. So even if it's not miscible, just the pressure support that it provides in the reservoir is sufficient to generate incremental barrels. And the less efficient, the more sequestered. And so you accomplish both things, producing incremental oil while also sequestering CO2. I think we have found in, for example, our operation, we believe we can do it in the Permian, the DJ, the Powder River, and our Oman reservoirs, as well as our Algeria reservoirs. So we think it's applicable to all those. So I think it'll be applicable to a lot of reservoirs in the world, and we need to apply it to as many as we can. It'll be tougher offshore because just the transport cost of getting it out there would be tough.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it'd be tough.
Processing.
Well, good. We get some EOR credits, tax credits. Are those going to be meaningful to Oxy?
They're going to be meaningful to us, and we're already, we feel that ultimately we'll have a carbon management business, and we'll be a carbon management business. We believe that in probably 20 to 25 years, we could be making almost as much from a carbon management business as we do from our chemicals at least, and maybe our oil and gas business. Even the first direct air capture facility that we're building is in the Permian Basin. And the first one will extract 500,000 tons of CO2 out of the atmosphere. The subsequent ones will extract 1 million tons out of the atmosphere. And so we're selling the carbon reduction credits for that first facility now. And it started out tough going 2 years ago. But now we've sold a lot of volume to aviation companies, a couple of airline companies, to the tech company, Amazon, and now we're getting quite a bit of demand for those credits. And when you use it when you're generating incremental oil from a CO2 enhanced oil recovery project using anthropogenic or atmospheric CO2, actually you can sell the oil, we believe, for a premium. So we have a couple of companies that we're dealing with that not only are companies buying this carbon reduction credits, but they're also companies that have indicated to us that they will pay incremental for the oil to convert to aviation fluids and maritime fluids, which are the two hardest to decarbonize industries. So that'll be, we believe, a business for us.
Good. You're actually benefiting other companies with this, and other industries' carbon footprint. So defined simply, Scope 1 direct emission, Scope 2 is indirect emissions through power usage, and Scope 3 is indirect emissions in the supply chain. So by helping others, would you see this maybe as a Scope 4 that hadn't been defined yet?
Maybe it's, it's an emerging industry, and we're learning more as we go along about how to define how this actually works over time. And it's there could be, there probably needs to be another scope, and that could be Scope 4, because it is something that needs to be better defined in terms of how do you manage the Scope 3, and what is the Scope 3? Because our Scope 3 is somebody else's Scope 1, so is that the Scope 4? I don't know, but it is getting very interesting. There's 2,800 companies around the world that have set carbon reduction goals or carbon neutrality goals, and those companies are very anxious to buy credits that are credible.
Great. I only have two other questions. One of them, you've got one of the geniuses that invests, that buys into your company as quite an owner. That's Warren Buffett. I know that perhaps some of the leverage that you had was kind of what brought him in to start with, but he's in there to stay, so everything's
Let's hope.
You hope. How's that going with Warren?
It's going amazing. He's been an incredible shareholder. I feel very privileged to get the opportunity to talk to him. Every conversation I've had with him, I've learned something, because he learned the industry very, very quickly. He picks up things just almost intuitively, and as I'm telling him things, I can tell by his reaction he sort of already knew it or had it in mind before I even say it out of my mouth. And so here recently he's gotten really interested in our technologies in the industry, and so we had a deep dive technology session, and then went back and on my next visit had a chance to talk with him again, and he wanted to talk technology again. And he always says this. He says, I don't know what this technology is. I'm not going to understand anything that you're saying, but he said, but I'm going to have fun trying. But he remembers everything. I found that out. He remembers everything. He has a mind that he can visualize and capture even technologies that he's never heard of before. He's amazing.
He'd be fun to work with, no doubt. One last question. You've been known for your own bold leadership. The Anadarko acquisition was one of those. As an example that comes to mind, I'm sure there are many others, but in addition to the role you play as a leader in your company, what role do you believe you play for women wanting to make a career in this industry? And it's important, we got a lot of students out there that could be stars with their future as well. So,
well, I felt a little bit of pressure in doing that, because it's just, there are two types of pressure that I've felt in my career. One is my first formal big leadership role was in Ecuador, where I had an advocate in the company who advocated me to get the role of running our Amazon jungle operations, when nobody wanted me to run it except him, and he fought to get me in the position. And so I got the role, and I worked my butt off, because I thought he went out on a limb for me to get this job. I've got to do a good job. And so now I sort of feel that we've got so many technical women who in our industry who've done phenomenal things and who have changed our industry. It's almost like, the movie of the NASA mathematicians. There needs to be a movie about the behind-the-scenes women who've made so many achievements for our industry on the technical side. And I kind of feel like I get a lot of exposure when they should be getting the most exposure. But I think I and they, we need to not just pave the way, but we need to help those that are coming our way, those that that have the capability, have the drive, the desire, and ultimately will be very, very strong leaders. We need to make sure we've paved the right path for them and done it the right way.
Well, you've done a great job in doing just that. We're out of time. We've used more time, but we could talk all day. Let's have a great hand for Vicki Hollop.
Thank you.
Thank you.
That was great.
Hey, Vicki.
That's wonderful. Thank you. Okay, great. Thank you, Mr. Ham, and thank you, Vicki Hollop. Next, we're going to move to a panel discussion on what is arguably the hottest topic in today's energy world. We're going to talk about LNG. We want to thank our friends at Cheniere Energy for sponsoring the panel. We're going to begin with our moderator, former U.S. Secretary of Energy and newly announced CEO of the Edison Electric Institute, Dan Brouillette. A round of applause for Dan. Our first panelist is President and CEO of Cheniere Energy. Welcome, Jack Fusco. Also joining the panel today, Executive Co-Chairman and Founder of Venture Global LNG, Bob Pender. The Chairman and CEO of Baker Hughes is also joining us. Welcome, Lorenzo Simonelli. And our final panelist is a partner at Quantum Capital Group and a board member of Mexico Pacific. Welcome, Blake Webster.
Great. Well, thank you, Maynard. I appreciate that. And welcome, everyone. What a fantastic afternoon here in Oklahoma City. And thank you for taking time to join this discussion. And it will be a discussion. I was talking to the panelists earlier. I want to make this not an interview session, not a Q&A session. It's not congressional testimony, so we're not going to put them under oath. What we want to have is a discussion about the changes in the natural gas markets here in the United States, but also around the world. So with that, again, thank you for the opportunity, Mr. Ham, Continental, the Ham Institute, thank you as well for the opportunity to join you today. With that, I will let each of the panelists introduce themselves, speak briefly about their companies, what they do, and from there we'll go to a broad discussion. So, Jack, lead us off.
Thank you, Dan. And hi, everybody. I'm Jack Fusco. I'm the President and CEO of Cheniere Energy. Since February of 2016, when we sent our first cargo out, we are now over 10% of the world LNG market. That's over 45 million tons of liquefaction processing. And to put it into your terms, we process about 7.5 BCF a day, every day, 7 days a week. Should I start over?
That's okay.
Could you all hear? Okay, now you can hear.
Now you can hear.
Because I can hear myself. I'm Jack Fusco. I'm the President and CEO of Cheniere Energy. Since February of 2016, when we sent out our first cargo, we've been growing our business. We've invested a little over $40 billion in our infrastructure, which is at our two sites, Sabine Pass and Corpus Christi. We have about 10% of the world LNG market. At this point, it's a little over 45 million tons. In your terms, we process 7.5 billion cubic feet of gas every day. It takes us 4 minutes to receive the gas at our flange and then process it and load it up on 2 tankers. Each tanker is 4 BCF. We initially had sent tankers out to 39 different countries, but now after the war, just about 80% of all of our product has been going to Europe.
Wow. That's great. Thanks, Jack.
I'm Bob Pender. I'm Executive Co-Chairman and Founder of Venture Global LNG. Our first project, Calcasieu Pass, is 10 MTPA, and it came online last year. We are currently shipping cargoes during commissioning. And we have a second project, which is financed and 65% complete on the Mississippi River, Plaquemines project, which is 20 MTPA. That will be coming online with first LNG next year. And we have 2 projects after that, each of which are 20 MTPA. CP2, which is, we hope, coming out of FERC in the next couple weeks. We've got our FEIS, and then we have a project behind that called Delta. We are so currently in the ground building 30 MTPA of capacity, which would be about 6 BCF a day. And we have another 40 MTA of capacity at Delta and CP2 that we're developing, and that would be kind of a total of 70 MTPA, thus about 14 Bs if we make that all happen.
Lorenzo Simonelli with Baker Hughes, and firstly, let me thank Harold for setting this up. I think been great discussion so far, and at Baker Hughes, we're an energy technology company, and I've got the pleasure of saying that amongst this panel, I get a chance to work with every one of them, because we're actually providing the liquefaction equipment that is predominantly used by the LNG producers, and we find ourselves in a privileged position to really help the world by providing a LNG which is affordable, secure, and sustainable, and taking advantage of the abundance of natural gas that is here in the United States. We do more than that. We are active from an exploration, extraction, all of the oil field services, Baker Oil Tools, Hughes, you may have heard of, but then also the equipment side of G Oil and Gas. And we have some laboratories in the back there that I had a chance to see, and it's just great to see how much we benefit from here in Oklahoma, also with the relationship with the university and some great talent. So good to be here.
Thanks. Blake Webster, a partner with Quantum Capital Group. Thanks again to the Ham Institute for hosting us. I'm actually standing in for the CEO of one of our portfolio companies called Mexico Pacific. So excited to talk to you a little bit more about that. Maybe first a little bit on Quantum. So Quantum was formed in 1998. We provide private capital to the energy space across the upstream, infrastructure, and energy transition universe. We've been very active in the Permian Basin historically, and as such, that really gave us a front seat to the real renaissance that went on with that play that Harold and Vicki were just talking about. So with the advent of horizontal drilling, the robust, oil volumes that follow with that, also came a lot of associated gas, and which also created real challenges for producers in terms of how they manage that. And if they don't manage it effectively, then risk curtailment of volumes as flaring is not a viable solution. So with challenges comes opportunity, and there comes Mexico Pacific. So Mexico Pacific is a project, LNG facility we're building on the west coast of Mexico. We will have capacity with phase one to evacuate approximately 2.5 BCF a day of gas directly from the Permian to our site, which then we will convert into approximately 15 MTPA of LNG destined for Asia. We're fortunate with our location that we can avoid the congestion of the Panama Canal and provide a direct conduit to those markets. And we've been fortunate to have some great commercial support as well. We've got 3 super majors who have signed up with us, ConocoPhillips, Exxon, and Shell, all of which who have material upstream interest in the basin and see that as a great direct access to Asia markets. So it's a big project. We've got some great partners. As Lorenzo mentioned, Baker Hughes is one of our partners in the project. We're also working with Bechtel on the engineering and construction side. We're working with ConocoPhillips from a technology standpoint. And lastly, working with Oklahoma-based ONEOK, helping us on the pipeline development as well. So it's a big project, but we're excited to move it forward.
That's great. Thank you, Blake. I appreciate that. And thank you all for those introductions and a little snapshot into your respective companies. And when I listened to you talk, Jack, you said you have 10% of the world market for LNG. Bob, you said that you were moving 6 BCF of gas a day. Blake, you just said 2 BCF a day out of potentially Mexico Pacific. I grew up a young pipeline welder in Louisiana, and back when I was welding pipe, we were talking about import facilities for natural gas. We were trying to bring natural gas into the United States. You guys are talking about, obviously, exports. Tell me what has changed in this marketplace in the time that you have each been in the business. Talk to me about Europe. Talk to me about Asia. What's going on around the world?
So I've been at Cheniere now for 7 years. Before that, I ran Calpine, the independent power company in Houston. And back then, when I was at Calpine, power generation on a hot summer day was using 20, 25 BCF a day of nat gas. Today, it uses 52 BCF a day. And thank goodness we found a lot more of it, right? Production's over 100 BCF a day. So all of the great innovation that was developed with horizontal drilling, everything we've heard this morning from Harold and from Mike Wirth and all, has just paid huge dividends for America. And I also saw, when I started in 2016, the demand for LNG was around 200 million tons. It's now over 480 million tons. So it's doubled, and it's going to double again. So the world, over the last year, has spent $1.3 trillion on building natural gas infrastructure. That's in power plants, that's pipelines, that's regas terminals. About 300 billion of that was in Europe from the crisis. The other 800 plus billion is all Asia. And they see a real need for nat gas, and especially in China, and they're going to be forced to reckon with.
That's interesting. Bob, you seeing the same thing at Venture Global?
Well, I think what is useful, I want to give some context. What Jack is talking about, Cheniere really is kind of the backbone of this program. Obviously, Sempra and Freeport, others have played a really important role. But 2016, when they came online, there was no exports from the United States of natural gas, of LNG. And in that short period of time, 7 years, we are providing a significant portion of the world's natural gas. It's worth mentioning why. One is that Henry Hub is a different index than the world has been buying when they buy LNG. They buy an oil-indexed, primarily, product. And so it took a while for our buyers to figure out that Henry Hub actually was a really good portfolio diversification. But it is now very much, it's going to be 25% or more of global supply. It needs to be 25% or 30% of global portfolios for anybody who is in energy. Secondly, we have a sophisticated gas system with 3 million miles of pipeline, and if we don't load, we can put that gas back into the system, and you don't have to ship it. That's not the case with the traditional projects that were built all over the world, where you contracted, you lifted, and you had a destination charge where you had to deliver it to a specific location. None of those apply when you buy from the United States, and that's made our gas incredibly attractive. So that's the first thing. This is a really attractive asset for the world's energy. Secondly, to complement the point that Jack was making, in the last 10 years, we've almost doubled the number of import terminals around the world. And we're now up to, I think, 45. We expect to be 55 in the next couple of years. The world wants and needs LNG because there's so many countries that don't have indigenous fuel. And this is, as they build renewables, this is how they're stabilizing their grids and providing affordable energy. I don't want to go any more. I want to give it to Lorenzo.
That's interesting. I'm going to move to Lorenzo. Lorenzo, you start, and then I'll ask you a follow-up question.
Yeah, sure. I was just going to say, and I think both Jack and Bob mentioned, the world has changed from viewing natural gas and LNG as a transition fuel to it being a destination fuel. And I think as I travel around and meet with various countries and companies, there is no way we're going to get through the need for energy without natural gas being at the destination. And I think that's become very clear over the course of the last year. And there's a huge opportunity here in North America because there's probably 200 years of gas, if not more, available for us to be able to provide to the world. And if you look at emissions, You saw the chart earlier, which had the reduction of emissions that's happened in the United States. The biggest sole reason that's occurred is coal to natural gas. And so if you want a way in which to reach the ambitions of emissions reductions, the rest of the world can follow and actually go from coal to natural gas. And it is the cleanest of the fossil fuels, and that's what we've got to continue to promote.
That's a good point, very good point, Lorenzo. I was going to ask you though, so Bob talked about the projects that they're building. Jack has obviously built some really big projects, and we're looking at increased demand for natural gas, not only here in the United States, but all around the world. Your company is right at the forefront of the technology and the development of these projects. Can you talk a little bit about the technologies that are coming online, some of the advancements that you see happening over the course of the next few years?
Definitely, and we've been in LNG for 40 years. And when you look at the first LNG out in Woodside in Australia, and what we do is really provide the capability of the liquefaction, a gas turbine and a compressor. And it's not easy to take natural gas and liquefy it at temperatures that are well below zero. So that's the technology that we do. Initially, it was very much stick-built and large scale. What you've seen happen over the course of the last 40 years is really a modularization and also various techniques to build LNG facilities. So what used to be large stick builds has moved into modules that can be large, can be medium, can be small. You've seen from onshore to floating LNG, and you name it, it's basically a variety of capabilities that unleashes also the resource that's available. If you look at lead times and you look at from a final investment decision to first cargo, I'd say you used to see examples of 48, 50 months. We now see examples of 29 months. And so really an acceleration of being able to give what the world needs from an energy perspective. And those techniques also mean going to electrification. The opportunity to use electric motors as opposed to gas turbines, also to reduce emissions by applying CCUS, and there's a multitude of technologies that we're looking at to make LNG really the fuel of choice as we go forward for natural gas.
Mm-hmm. Thanks, Lorenzo. So as I think about these projects, they're enormous. The technology's changing. They're not cheap to build. I know Jack and Bob and Mexico Pacific, as well as my former employer, Sempra Infrastructure, we spend billions of dollars trying to build these things. And Blake, I'm gonna toss this over to you. Talk to us about the financing world. So, Lorenzo just mentioned that some of the things are moving along very quickly. We're able to shorten time frames, make things more efficient. But there are some who argue that there are roadblocks, and one of them being financing to these projects actually coming to final investment decision. And part of that is an ESG movement that seemingly wants to put an end to fossil fuels. Some of that is regulatory construct, both here in the United States and around the world. What are you seeing in the finance world, and are there challenges to providing capital to these projects?
Sure, no, great question, Dan. First of all, and add another potential challenge to it, is just the size and scale of these projects is growing tremendously. So previously you'd look at a phase with a 1 train or 2 train, and now you're looking at taking FID on 3 trains. So that just adds to the quantum of capital issue. I do think we've seen, positive developments on the banking side, certainly. We've seen the commercial banks step up and support financing LNG. Quantum, from our standpoint, we're more of a we're taking more ownership in the development side, so pre-FID capital. But there are, ample sources of more project equity capital, not only from GPs, infrastructure funds, but also LPs who like to make, direct investments in these projects. So, look, I think at the end of the day, the demand for LNG is gonna drive it. But from our seat, we have seen a willing support of these projects from the various financial sources.
Do you all agree with that? I mean, I just went through this process with Sempra Infrastructure, and I got to tell you, it was hard. Getting to FID on one of these projects is a major undertaking. Do you guys agree?
I'm probably going to have a different view of this than you guys, so let me just say my piece. The key issue for American LNG is to provide affordable energy around the world. The United States is privileged. We can afford to throw ITC and PTC and renewable, portfolio standards and tax credits to encourage renewables. The developing world will not do that. One of the backbones of why we developed our company, my partner Mike Sable and I put this company together, because if we could find a way to actually develop LNG export projects cheaper than the traditional way of doing it, you actually can land LNG in Asia, in Europe, competitive with coal. We'll come back to what just happened, disrupting that whole issue with Mr. Putin. Nobody saw that coming. That's the backbone of Venture Global. We have worked closely with Lorenzo. We've developed a modular approach, but frankly, it's much more than that. It's contractual, it's oversight, it's procurement. It's actually owner-driven construction so that we actually deliver faster and cheaper. And as a consequence, we had good, healthy models that showed that our projects were not only with good customers, but were healthy. And while we did in 2019 the largest project financing in the world in 2019, in 2022 and 23, we've done phase 1 and phase 2 of Plaquemines, which together constitutes the largest project financing ever done in the world. So our company has raised $44 billion worth of capital to date. We have tapped every dollar of capital to do that, available in Asia, in North America, and in Europe. And we have had a robust support for that. I would say, in all fairness, we've seen 2 or 3 French banks pull out, but essentially the world was waffling, but then it was actually before Putin. I think 2021, we saw that there was, after Biden came into office, but before Putin, the wind stopped blowing in Europe. I don't know if you guys remember this, but people saw that they were going to need natural gas to get through the winter before Putin even invaded. That completely changed the financial lay of the land, and banks realized that gas was here going to be much longer than before. So I would say we feel the financial markets, both bond markets and bank market, have been deep and robust. I do think some projects which have a higher cost have thinner margins, and then that runs into issues. But so far, we are encouraged that the whole industry is actually building multiple projects. No one is doing it to the exclusion of anybody else.
Yeah, that's good. Jack, you agree?
Yeah, we haven't had a problem because we do it a little bit different. We try to commercialize our projects first. These are very large infrastructure projects. We have over 35 customers that have signed contracts with us for over 20 years. Our contract length goes out to 2053, I think is the longest that we have now. And we sell all of our output before we take it to the banks. On our expansion project that'll take us to 60 million tons or 10 BCF a day ourselves, which is under construction right now, we needed $8 billion of financing. We funded $4 billion with our own equity, and then the other 4 from the banks. We had 33 banks line up to help us fund it. So I haven't found an issue with the capital markets. BlackRock is our largest investor in our company. So there's a lot said about ESG and those types of things, but they like us.
Well, that's good, because we need you. We need more natural gas, there's no question about that. And I was looking at a few comments earlier that was shared by Shaylin Hines, who's somewhere here in the audience. There she is right there. She sent me a note because there was an important comment that were made to Bob's point, to your point, Jack, and to your point, Lorenzo, about the demand for LNG, U.S. LNG in particular, around the world. Ditte Jorgensen is the Director General for Energy for the European Commission, and I'll just quote her real quick. She says, we will need some fossil fuel molecules in the system over the coming couple of decades. That's quite a change from what we've heard in Europe over the course of the last few years. I know Mike Pompeo was here earlier. I don't know if Mike is still with us, but Secretary Pompeo and I were practically thrown out of European offices when we were in office for promoting diversification of energy supply, things like LNG, as well as suppliers, particularly in places like Germany. But it seems to have changed. Now there's a recognition in Europe that natural gas is going to be part of the energy portfolio there for quite some time for a number of different reasons. I think, to your point, Bob, to meet emissions goals that were set under the Paris Accords in 2015, be they 2030 goals or 2050 goals. I think some of that's backsliding a little bit, as we saw in the UK. But nonetheless, we're going to have natural gas as part of that portfolio. There will be some demand. But there's also another reason for doing this. And I want you guys to talk about this, because in the last 2 to 3 years, I think we've seen a change. And that has to do with security in Europe. Mr. Putin's invasion of Ukraine has fundamentally changed the landscape in Europe, and I would dare say changed the landscape in Asia as well. And Blake, I want to bring you into this, and Lorenzo, I want to bring you into this as well, because I think you guys are looking at this internationally as well. So if you could just comment on that. Are we seeing a rebalance of climate policy with energy security or not?
I'll start, and then Blake, I'll pass it to you. I think we're seeing realism set in, and it's unfortunate that it came about because of Russia invading Ukraine. But across the board in Europe, there's a better appreciation that you need diversification, and natural gas and LNG has a role to play in the energy mix. I'd also say they still have some way to go to realize that it's multiple decades that they're going to need it. There's still too many people thinking 5 to 10 years, and there's still too much industrial actual destruction taking place in Europe that needs to be addressed by making sure that there's ample, secure energy. As you go to Asia, Southeast Asia, China, India, they actually have realized a long time ago that natural gas is the way in which they can continue to provide more and more energy. And we're seeing that across the globe, there is a large demand. And I look at what JERA does as a good barometer for what's happening in LNG. And I was recently at a conference, and there was this discussion around, are they signing long-term agreements, offtake agreements? They're back in the market, and they're signing 20-year plus offtake agreements. You look at what China did with Qatar, again, a record number of years. So I think, even though it's unfortunate, and I think it would have happened anyway, people are realizing that globally, natural gas LNG is going to be the savior while we actually go through a lot of the evolution of the energy mix. And transition is the wrong word, because it's and. There is no reduction in the consumption of energy. Energy is going to continue to increase in consumption, and we need as much natural gas and LNG as possible.
Think there's some applause over here.
Maybe just to add on Lorenzo's point, I mean, when you talk about energy security, you know, Asian countries get that. I mean, you're talking about countries with very little indigenous, natural resources. We've seen them being, very, very aggressive and looking out certainly beyond that, 20 years plus. And, we see that trend continuing.
Yeah.
Can I
Yeah, go ahead, Bob.
one comment?
Yeah.
I know Dita, she has been between a rock and a hard place for a long time.
Mm-hmm.
This has been a very awkward thing for them to deal with security of supply in Europe after the invasion. With the fact that it is the Green Party in control of Germany, the Green Party is in fact having to do the opposite of what their natural instinct is. I agreed with Mike Pompeo. I think there's been considerable concern by a lot of us that as soon as a settlement happens with Putin in Ukraine, a lot of the Europeans will go back to buying Russian gas. But I think what she's saying is that this conflict may last a long time, And I think a lot of their large utilities in Europe have been reluctant to sign 20-year contracts because it doesn't meet their aspirations for meeting their carbon neutrality goals by 2030, 2035. And so how can they sign a contract that would go past their own political commitments? Her statement is a clear indication that the utilities and large IOCs in Europe can have permission to sign 20-year contracts. That's exactly how we looked at it.
That's how you read it.
So we've been working with the European Commission for quite a few years, and with Dita specifically and her staff. We started off, there was a smear campaign on U.S. natural gas. Yeah. And the campaign, the Russians and the Qataris had, quote, developed a life cycle analysis of the amount of emissions that came out of producing and processing, transporting, liquefying, and shipping U.S. LNG. And it was wrong by hundreds of percent on the emissions side. So the only way we could prove it is we did our own life cycle analysis. We hired third parties. We published it in the American Society of Chemical Engineers. We had it commented by academia, and we took those comments and we made it better, and then we really published it, and we published it to the world. And that's why there was a switch that went off in the European Commission that, hey, wait a minute, America is transparent on its emissions and its regulations. And you know, maybe we should take another hard look at it. Out of the 35 long-term customers we have 14 of them are Western Europeans, and they're well over 20 years. We just signed up with Equinor, 2 more contracts with Equinor recently, and now with BASF in Germany. But they're all looking at diversity of supply, and it goes beyond just nat gas here in America. Yeah. And we want to be extremely supportive of those folks and our allies.
What about China? Are we seeing the same movement toward natural gas in China? Because you know, I think as we think about China, they're one of the larger emitters along with the United States, but nonetheless, they're a larger emitter. They use enormous amounts of coal. Are we seeing any switching there?
Yeah, so they need a lot of everything. So when in November of 2017, when I was in China with President Trump and Secretary Ross, at the Chinese State Department dinner, they sat me in between the head of nuclear construction and the head of coal construction. The nuclear, they were building 26 nuclear power plants at that time, and they were building over 100 coal plants at that time. And they just peppered me with questions on natural gas-fired combined cycle power plants. Their version of a power plant is a 1,500 megawatt CCGT in the city limits. And quite honestly, we've sent them US LNG to commission those power plants. They have a pipeline that goes out to a dock, and the LNG flows into the dock and it powers a power plant. But as much and as difficult, as hard as they try to use more gas, they always stay at right around 6% of the total energy mix in China, because everything else is growing so rapidly. But and then here lately, when things went crazy, the Chinese were very astute and started burning a lot more coal, which is why King Coal came back in record tonnages last year, and they sold all their LNG to Europe.
Sure. Rational economic move, I suppose, right?
I just want to add, you know, we also do a lot of work with China, and we see their demand going up. It is as a portion of global LNG demand, not, you know, our sales to them are in proportion to their consumption relative to global consumption. So we have a full portfolio of European, IOC, and Asian demand. You know, I do think in this room, we need to be aware. I just want to go back to the chart that was up this morning John had, that the United States has the greatest reductions of carbon of any country on the planet. From 1995 to today, our carbon emissions are, even with growth of our population and growth of GDP, we have carbon emissions which are kind of at the 1995 level. That is probably why Obama was able to sign the Paris Accord. That was purely, as Lorenzo pointed out, purely about fuel switching from coal to gas. And it was not driven by the regulators, it was driven by the market, because you guys figured out how to extract gas cheaply, and that gas made it uneconomic to develop coal plants. We can do that same miracle worldwide. We can export natural gas to the world so that the developing countries don't default to coal to drive their economies. China has 1,100 coal plants, and I think since the pandemic, they've started building and are permitting another 260 to 300. It makes comical the idea of California or New York, stopping a pipeline or going to straws that are plastic. This is what we need to do to actually address climate change. If that's your focus, it's not, I focus on national security, on balance of trades, on all sorts of other issues. But the fact is, if you're focused on climate change, the best thing we can do for the world is to export. I do think the challenge with China is, as Jack pointed out, they have so much demand that they still will need the coal and the gas and the nuclear and the renewables to drive their economy. But it goes back to the issue I mentioned earlier. We need to be able to have innovation. You guys have innovated. We've tried to innovate on the liquefaction side so that we can land natural gas competitively. They will not do subsidies. Vietnam, Philippines, Laos, Malaysia, India, China, they won't subsidize renewables. We need to have a market signal by figuring out through American ingenuity how to land LNG competitive with all the other products so that we can actually have a lower carbon energy transition.
Interesting. So, Lorenzo, you want to add to that, or you? Okay. So, you talked about Lorenzo, you raised the question of transition and that definition. And some of you have heard me say this before. I think the term transition needs a new definition. If I have 9 kids, we homeschool them. If you think about the definition of transition, it usually means something simple like moving from something to something else. And if you think about that in an energy context, there's a notion out there that we're going to move from fossil fuels to 100% renewables. And in my study of American history and world history and energy history in particular, I've never seen that happen. It's always been additive. I think Lorenzo was the point, or Bob made the point that it's always been more. Populations grow, economies grow, we need more energy to move them forward. We're just going to add more to the portfolio. It may change, the percentages may change within the portfolio, but we've never moved away from a fuel source. We simply added to it. But, as I look through some of the headlines this morning and over the course of the last week, I see that the IEA, our friend Fatih Birol, is going to put out a new study, and I respect Fatih. I think he's done some really good work. I think he can be wrong on occasion, as we all can be. But nonetheless, he says that we may be reaching the point in this decade of peak oil production, and with that, potentially peak gas production. And he also points out that there are 2 transitions that are occurring, one in the global north and one in the global south. And Dan Yergin has also talked about this. I don't know if each of you have had a chance to look at it, but I think you've alluded to that. It appears that there is not, as Dan Yergin says, a linear transition to these renewable technologies. Gas is going to be part of our portfolio for quite some time. We've talked about that. But on a policy standpoint, when you think about this, taking a step back from your individual businesses, do you agree or disagree with this notion that there isn't a linear transition?
Maybe I'll jump in there and, again, I won't speak directly to Fatih Birol and what he published in the IEA, but I think at the end, we look at it as being all fuel types are going to be necessary. And the sooner we can stop talking about fuel types and talk about emissions, the better it will be, because technology will be the enabler to reduce emissions. But to think that we're going to stop using natural gas or we're going to stop using oil is, I think, delusionary at this stage. And there's also a misconception around electrification and chemistry. At the end of the day, and I think Amrita mentioned it as well, a lot of the oil and a lot of the gas is not going into just electricity. It is going into the consumables that everybody has in their daily lives. And we seem to have forgotten physics and chemistry. And the article that was published by Lego is another example. These are tough challenges. And if we keep on putting timelines or trying to eliminate things, let's focus on the real issue at hand, emissions. Let's deal with the emissions and not target the fuel source. And let's use what we have in abundance. And that's where natural gas is so important.
It's great, Lorenzo. Great concluding comment. I see that we only have about a minute left. So if anyone wants to make any closing comments, I'll give you a couple seconds to do that, or I'll just close it out.
No, I just want to say what happened in the Ukraine, and the president said we need to export another 15 million tons to Europe. I found that extremely personal. So I'm first generation American. My parents are both from Italy. And I went back to the company and I said, we got to step up. And the team, they met and they figured out how we could optimize some of our maintenance hours that we had. They figured out how we could squeeze out more molecules through the liquefaction process, and that created another virtual train for us, another 5 million tons of processing just on its own. And we were able to send 638 tankers to Europe in 2022. And as Brian Sullivan said, he got the stat from us, which was 1 tanker is enough to heat 1 million European homes for a month. And I felt extremely humbled and very, very pleased with the company for doing that. And I hope at the end of the day, that'll be my legacy.
That's fantastic, Jack. Thank you for that. Thank you for your service. Let me just conclude by saying I think what we've heard today is that there's going to be a very strong demand for natural gas, again, not only here in the United States, but all around the world. It's a very important part of our energy portfolios. But I hope that you also heard that these are leaders, not only in the energy space, but they're also leaders in the national security space, and they're leaders in the environmental space. You contribute to the reduction of carbon emissions, you contribute to the security of America and our allies around the world, and you lead in so many different ways that people sometimes don't really appreciate or recognize. So thank you for your service, thank you to America, thank you to the world. And give these people a round of applause.
Okay, well, Dan, thank you for moderating. Jack, Bob, Lorenzo, Blake, thanks you so much, guys, for your contribution there. Thank you. Thank you, Lorenzo. Thanks, Blake. That was awesome. Okay, we have an official, sanctioned 10-minute break. So stretch, have a cup of coffee. We've got 4 more panels when we come back, so stay focused, but we'll see you in 10 minutes.
9.
Please be seated. The American Energy Security Summit will resume in a few minutes. Welcome back to the afternoon sessions of the American Energy Security Summit. Here again is our Master of Ceremonies, Maynard Holt.
Okay, thanks everybody. If we could ask you to come back to your seats, we'll get going. Oh, sorry, Governor. All right. Great, thank you so much. In our next panel discussion, we're going to talk about carbon capture. We've entitled the discussion, Carbon Capture, Producing Responsibly. We want to thank everyone at Chesapeake Energy for sponsoring this discussion. The session is going to be moderated by the Governor of North Dakota. Welcome back, Doug Burgum. And also welcome back President and CEO of Occidental Petroleum, Vicki Hollub. I'd also like to welcome the President and CEO of Denbury Resources, my friend Chris Kendall. And also joining our panel today is the Summit Agricultural Group CEO, Justin Kirchhoff. Governor?
Thank you. Hey, let's give it up for Maynard. He's doing a great job today as our host. Thank you, Maynard. Way to go. Thank you all for making it back from the first break of the day. Harold works everybody as hard at these conferences as he does at Continental. But we're great to have you back. And I'm glad you're not missing this because this is a first. This is the most awesome CO2 panel ever assembled, ever, at any energy conference. So this is it right now. We've already set the bar. They don't have to say anything. But we've got on the panel over 90 years of experience, global experience, building companies through all the changes that have been talked about today, the transitions. And now we're at the beginning of this new future. Carbon management is going to be a separate, huge business and industry by itself. We got 3 folks that are on the cutting edge of that, and very exciting. So we're going to hear from all of them, but we're going to go down the line first. Chris is going to tell us a little bit about Denbury, then we'll go to Vicki, then we'll go to Justin, then we'll come back and start with the hard-hitting, insightful questions.
All right, thanks, Governor Burgum. And Harold, thanks to you for bringing this amazing group of people together in an amazing event. I'm honored to be part of it. Just talking about Denbury a little bit, Denbury is a company that has its roots in enhanced oil recovery, the same process that Vicki talked about in her piece earlier today. We built a pretty good sized business out of that, producing about 50,000 barrels of oil a day, about 2/3 of it using that process. Along with that, we built a tremendous network of CO2 pipelines, over 900 miles of CO2 pipe on the Gulf Coast through the key industrial areas of the Gulf Coast. And the remainder up in the Rocky Mountain region, beginning in Wyoming, moving through Montana, and then into Governor Burgum's great state. And our newest EOR flood is right there in Bowman County. Along the way, about 3 years ago, we took a hard look at our strategy and decided that those assets and that expertise that we have were exactly right for a world that needed to remove carbon from the atmosphere through one manner or another. And so we've leaned hard into using those assets to move CO2 that's captured from industrial sources, put it permanently underground. If you look at us today, we're doing that with more than 4 million tons of CO2 a year. Of course, our vision is far beyond that.
Great. Vicki?
Okay, Occidental Petroleum is an oil and gas company, but with a chemicals business and midstream and marketing. And I would say that with respect to carbon capture, we are leveraging our core competence of 50 years of CO2 enhanced oil recovery flooding in the Permian Basin, where we produce about 150,000 barrels of oil per day from CO2 flooding, but not all of that is from anthropogenic. Actually, the bulk of that is from organic sources that we're in the process of converting from organic to anthropogenic and atmospheric. And we had the first, one of the first carbon capture plants in the U.S. and in the world was the Terrell plant there in the Permian.
Justin Kirchhoff with Summit Agricultural Group. We're headquartered up in Iowa. We make investments in ag and renewable energy. We operate down in Brazil and here in the U.S. Down in Brazil, we've got a low-carbon biofuel company called FS. We produce about 550 million gallons of low-carbon ethanol down in Brazil, utilizing biomass as our energy need and then second crop corn. So Today, we believe we produce the lowest carbon liquid fuel at scale around the world, and we're actually next week going to start drilling our first CCS well in Brazil to actually take that carbon score to negative. Here in the US, we've got a couple of projects, one of which is Summit Carbon Solutions, which is about 34 ethanol plants that have signed long-term offtake agreements with us. So we're currently in the process of permitting about 2,000 miles of pipeline across Iowa, Minnesota, Nebraska, South Dakota, and North Dakota. And the value proposition there is kind of out of the gate to obviously decarbonize the ethanol industry. You can cut their carbon intensity score approximately in half by capturing that carbon. Longer term, the opportunity to decarbonize the liquid fuel tank and make it more competitive is really our goal. And the last project I would mention is a sustainable aviation fuel plant that we recently announced in the Gulf Coast. So we're planning to build a plant that would take ethanol and convert it into SAF, or sustainable aviation fuel, utilizing Honeywell UOP's process technology. It'll be about 450 million gallons of ethanol in the front and about 250 million gallons of SAF on the back end. So the kind of theme for us is ag, energy, decarbonization, and try and work at scale.
Great. Of course, our host today, Harold Hamm, has written a book called Game Changers. We've talked a lot about how the breakthrough, the whole energy revolution in America was really driven by innovation around horizontal drilling. But of course, Harold also, I think, was 170 meetings that you took in DC, one-on-ones, I mean, to try to break this logjam on being able to have the U.S. export ban, and think of where we'd be, the pickle we'd be in today if we hadn't got that lifted. But then another big breakthrough, which is maybe less obvious to all of you, but it was reported to me by, I think, both of our senators, Senator Hoeven and Senator Kramer, is that Harold Hamm walked in their office one day after decades of, the traditional battles between who's fighting for the market share in a tank of gas in a car. Is it 100%, gas from a petroleum, or is it 10 or 15% from ethanol? And, and Harold is the guy that's looking around the corners and said, hey, there's an opportunity for agriculture and energy industries to come together to produce low carbon fuels. That's what I'm talking about, Team USA, low carbon fuels. So what Justin's just talking about, this project, one of the largest investors in that is Harold Hamm. And I'm just thrilled because on a state where we are an energy state and a huge ag state, to have everybody on the same team is absolutely fantastic. So again, thank you, Harold, for being a game changer, because we wouldn't be having this conversation up here, I don't think, without the work that you're doing. But back on the ground, there's a lot of challenges. I'm going to ask each of you to face that, because just like we've got a group of people that are opposed to fossil fuels, there's a group of people that are opposed to somehow taking CO2 out of fossil fuels. Isn't that confusing? You think they would be for that as opposed to against that. But we got two of you are public companies. Justin, you've got private, but you've got all the challenges pipeline. But let's just talk a little bit about misinformation versus information, challenges you have as CEOs in dealing with, as this burgeoning industry of CO2 and CO2 management. Talk about what are the challenges we have as an industry to overcome?
Sure, and I think it's interesting the way you laid it out, Governor Burgum. I think that the center, either left or right of the center, loves what we're doing. I mean, we're doing everything that makes sense here. We're using existing technologies. We're taking CO2 either from the tailgates of plants or from the air and reducing atmospheric CO2 emissions. So the center loves this, but what I think is on one side you have perhaps a dogmatic opposition to hydrocarbons, even if there are no emissions associated with those hydrocarbons, or on a net basis at least, you're negative. And to me, thinking back on something Vicki said at a conference I was at a few months ago, she said, emissions are the enemy. Hydrocarbons are not the enemy. Let's go after emissions. And so that common sense approach is great, but I think we see on one side that dogmatic opposition, and then I mean some, and I think maybe Justin could talk more to this, but on the further on the right, he's running into some challenges there as well.
Vicki?
Yeah, I'll just say that I was talking earlier about using atmospheric CO2 and enhanced oil recovery, and how that's not only a way to add value to our shareholders, it's also a way to help the U.S. become or stay energy independent, because we'll get more out of the reservoirs we have in the United States. We need that to happen. But the challenge is that, that as we started trying to sell the carbon reduction credits from our first direct air capture facility, what we faced was CEOs of companies that want to become carbon neutral, so they need our credits, but who did not want the CO2 used in enhanced oil recovery because they felt, although they understood it and they see the logic, they could not take the chance that their customers would revolt against that. And so what we face today is the challenge of helping people, the world, understand that CO2 is sequestered in oil reservoirs and that the math works. So we're trying to get that message out, and until we get that message out, it's going to be difficult for any of us up here to do the right thing and use CO2 in enhanced oil recovery, because people are either not going to want to buy it or they're going to want to pay a significant discount for use in EOR. And so that's a challenge we face. Otherwise, it's going to be difficult for the United States to extend our period of energy independence.
Yeah, Governor, I think you hit on a few things that we're seeing right now. I think it's interesting. So we've got, the way I see it, we've got blue policies being implemented in red states in a lot of areas. And so we see a few things. I think as we go across kind of the states that we're operating in, some might not believe in kind of the ideology of it, but at the end of the day, they recognize that it's going to help agriculture, it's going to help the internal combustion engine. So that's kind of the fight from the far left, which is they recognize it's going to help those industries. The safety aspect of it is something that continues to come up, and I think the reality is there's been 5,000 miles or so of pipelines in the U.S. for, call it 4 decades-ish, operating carbon pipelines, and there's never been anybody that's been admitted to the hospital, and there's never been a fatality. And so, but all that being said, you still have to educate folks, right? We're putting a pipeline in an area that traditionally has not had CO2 pipelines, so there is that conversation. So that grabs a lot of the headlines, but I would say overarching all that is, you know, our pipeline will go through 5,500 landowners. We've gotten around 75% of them to already sign voluntary agreements to put the pipeline, you know, on their property. So there is definitely broad-based support, but as we know, the headlines sometimes don't reflect that.
Yeah, in most places, 75% would be called a supermajority. But the expectation is you got to get to 100, I guess. That's part of what you're dealing with. But on the safety issue, I did get asked in North Dakota, I said, would you ever live next to a CO2 pipeline? And I said, yes. And then they were surprised, and they said, well, would you have your family live by one? And I said, yes. And they said, really? And I said, well, yeah, we live by a highway most of our life. And they said, well, what does that have to do with anything? I said, well, we kill 40,000 people a year on highways. We've killed 0 in the entire history of CO2 pipelines. But I mean, I think this is a classic thing where misinformation is so strong, both around the whole CO2 industry, but also about CO2. These are all weaponized things to try to basically have a full-on attack, I believe, on liquid fuels and on fossil fuels in general. So so we are fighting a battle. Vicki, when you were talking about the customers of or the shareholders of your customers, it makes me think we ought to think about rebranding what EOR is, because if it's got the word oil in it, they're probably going to be against it. So let your marketing teams work on that, but we might need a different acronym.
You're absolutely right on that.
Yeah. Okay, so back on this, and on safety, I say we've had a pipeline in North Dakota operating for EOR. It's been operating for 20 years, taking off of a point plant solution and going up into the Weyburn field in Canada. 42 million tons of CO2 have been moved without an incident. And we've got ranchers there that I think that have forgotten that the pipeline's even on their land. But meanwhile, you know, an hour away, we got people, you know, protesting a new line, which doesn't make sense. So even in our own state, we've got misinformation between the safety track record. And of course, yours has been operating perfectly, coming from Wyoming into North Dakota and doing that. We've talked about, people know about blue hydrogen, talk about what you talk about blue oil.
Sure, and you know, when we think about maybe changing the terminology here, this concept of the efficiency of enhanced oil recovery, pumping liquid CO2 underground to extract oil, where all of the CO2 ultimately stays in the ground. For many years, the efficiency of these fields was something that we were working to use less and less CO2 because of the cost of the CO2. But as we look at maybe a different objective, which is putting more CO2 in the ground, there's a level of inefficiency that you can still have that's very economic for producing the oil, but what happens with that, just notionally in Denbury's business, every barrel of oil that we produce with EOR has a carbon footprint of about 1,200 pounds of CO2, about 1,200 pounds. But to produce that oil, we're putting, on average, 1,700 pounds of CO2 permanently underground. Now, my math, that's 500 pounds that stays permanently underground, and when that's captured from industry, that's a carbon negative barrel of oil by quite a bit. We titled it Blue Oil. Right now, in your state, we're producing a little over 1,000 barrels a day of that. In aggregate, much more than that across the whole company. But that's something that we think, in a world that needs liquid fuels, where we look at synthesis of liquid fuels and other ways of deriving them, if we can pre-offset the emissions by planting that CO2 permanently underground, we have made that liquid fuel using the same systems that we have and the same infrastructure that we have, and I just think that's a beautiful solution.
Well, it is, and like I said earlier this morning, I mean, this is why Denbury can actually claim, using the same math of carbon offsets, that they're greener than Patagonia, because you got almost a 50% gain on your 1,700 versus 1,200 there. Vicki, you already did this panel kind of earlier today with Harold. Harold, you asked her every question I was going to ask her, by the way, during your great interview with Vicki, but we've got more. You mentioned so many technologies, nanotechnology, this cool thing you're doing with direct air capture. Just talk a little bit more, double click down for the audience on where you see the technology going and where this can take Occidental.
Yeah, the direct air capture, we're already starting to see a lot of interest in this. And so globally, we'll not only utilize this here in the United States. We just signed a deal with ADNOC to look at building it in Abu Dhabi. So I think that this is going to catch on and expand around the world. The net power that I talked about earlier, because of the fact that that's emission-free, we think that there's going to be demand from a lot of companies in the Middle East, Indonesia, because they have a lot of gas, in the Asian area in general, and in Africa too. So we're really excited about that technology. The other two that I didn't mention is lithium, and I would say that our core we're not doing anything that's outside our core competence. We're using our core competence for all of our strategies. And so we have a lithium technology that will extract lithium out of brine water. And we justify that being a part of our core competence because of the fact that between our chemicals business, which is a chlor-alkali business, chlorovinyls, and then our oil and gas business, between the two of them, I think we're one of the largest movers of brine in the U.S. And so the lithium that we'll extract, we hope to be able to use for industrial-sized batteries to support our operations ultimately. We don't have the battery technology yet, but we do have the extraction technology. The other thing that we need to do for our chemicals business to help it become carbon neutral is to convert CO2 to bioethylene. And we're building a pilot plant with Cemvita, a small startup company in Houston, to do that using photosynthesis. So we're excited about that.
Yeah, it is exciting. It's great that you're able to bring your chemistry and your chemical business in with the oil business together for those synergies. Justin, talk a little bit about markets. You get this Summit pipeline built. What does that do to the value of a corn acre across the whole Midwest? What does it do to create the United States as a leader in sustainable aviation fuel? So talk a little bit about the benefits to customers and the market potential.
Yeah, I think on our project in particular, if you think about capturing CO2 from an ethanol plant, we think it's very, very low on the cost scale. So we're somewhere in the $30 to $40, $50 a ton to capture it, and that's largely driven by the fact that when you ferment corn ethanol, it basically emits pure CO2, so it's relatively inexpensive to capture. What that means from a profitability perspective is that ethanol plant is probably able to generate another 35 cents a gallon in profit. And longer term, they're going to have the opportunity to get to SAF or SAF. I think getting to that point is going to unlock a much bigger opportunity, just given that we think ethanol is by far the best feedstock to produce sustainable aviation fuel, just given the scale that you have and the ability to do that at a much lower CI. It's going to mean a lot to rural America, frankly, in terms of land values and what that's going to mean to the communities. But from our perspective, if you look at this over the long term, our goal would be you start capturing CO2 off ethanol plants, it allows the infrastructure to be built, and then you start thinking about what else makes sense to decarbonize now that you have the infrastructure. That could be coal plants, it could be natural gas, electricity plants, it could be a variety of things, but you need to get the infrastructure to build. And in our mind, you want to start with the cheapest CO2 to do that.
Yes, and of course, in North Dakota, as you know, two of our ethanol plants that don't require pipeline because they're situated in a part of our state where they're on top of incredible storage. Those two are already doing the capture, and they're selling into markets at a premium, like the California market today. And so we know that it's economic. We know that it is the lowest cost way to capture. And I think that was, Bill Berry and Harold, your analysis was, hey, the fastest way to do that would be, connecting with liquid fuels through ethanol. Back on Denbury, you had an announcement back in July.
We did. Yeah, we, as we followed the path down, growing into the CCUS space, and just the great success that we had in signing agreements with emitters and building the future of that business, using our pipeline as a network rather than a hub and spoke, but rather as a network, like a subway station or a subway from one end of town to the other. You can get on and off throughout, and what that does is it just massively amplifies the capacity of what you can do with that. And we talk about the challenges in our country here, in our world, and new infrastructure of any kind is hard. It doesn't have to be just in the oil and gas industry. You name it, it's hard. And so having this extensive pipeline in the ground and operating, it's really irreplaceable. As we looked at what we could do with that, and we had taken this a long way, as strange as it might sound, companies so vastly different in size as ExxonMobil and Denbury had a very common vision for what CCUS can look like and how that can be amplified. When we looked at Denbury's scale and the balance sheet that we thought we would need to really be all that we could be, and to do all that carbon capture needs to do to make an impact in our country, that combination to us just made great sense. And we're able to use all of the expertise that we have as a company, couple that with the great qualities of ExxonMobil, the great balance sheet that they have, and we just think it's going to amplify what we're able to do massively here.
Artfully done. There was no forward-looking statements made during that little description.
Thank you.
Well done. Vicki, one of the things that you've got as a large market cap, I think about 55 billion market cap. How much do the shareholders and Warren Buffett, how much do they care about this piece of your business versus the traditional piece, and how do you think about cash flows and capital allocation between the core and the carbon management side of business?
Currently that's a challenge for us. It's our oil and gas business is our core business. Chemicals, so the oil and gas business provides about 90% of the cash flow and earnings for the company. So chemicals relative to oil and gas is not as big, but helpful in a downturn because it's usually not down when oil and gas is down. So our shareholders have gotten used to that, and I would say most of our shareholders right now are not giving a lot of value to our low carbon strategy. There's one shareholder who's declared they were giving $3 a share. So we've been very careful about how much capital to allocate. So we're going pretty slowly with this. Our ultimate plan is to try to prove up the technology with the first few units. So the first one we're funding ourselves. The second one that'll be at the King Ranch in Texas is going to be partially funded by the DOE. That was just announced a few weeks ago. So we'll have some funding for that. Beyond that, we're hoping to use, once we get the technology approved, project finance. But it's been a concern to some of our oil and gas shareholders. So I've developed a way to talk to our shareholders about it, helping to assure them that in the near term, until the technology is proven up, until we can have a better way to finance it, to ensure that we're not starving cash from the oil and gas, the core business, that we're being very, very cautious. And so I gave that same message to one shareholder last week who said, wait a minute now, we don't want you to grow your oil and gas business because we want the low carbon business to be the business. You said you would ultimately be a carbon management business. And I said, yeah, but that's with both being, about the same size, and that's like way down the road. And so there is a challenge when you're trying to transform into something different, but you're trying to stay true to what your core competence is and what you're going to need to provide some of the funds to build the extra business. And so right now it's really kind of like a balancing act between making sure that we're making the right capital allocation decisions as we prove up this technology and get to a point where it can pretty much self-fund.
Justin, part of the core project here, pulling off of 31 ethanol plants across the Midwest is the Carbon Express pipeline. America today, I say pipeline, somebody else says protest. It's like a game. I say pipeline, you say protest. We've lived through this in North Dakota. It's odd to me that some of the people that might be protesting have got the talking points of the ones that were fighting against Dakota Access or fighting against Keystone. And then you've got this other piece. But what have you learned? Because we have to have infrastructure. And as I talked about this morning with the Biden administration, if you want to have the nation's fleet running EVs, the estimate is it would take 3 to 5 times the transmission lines in our country to be able to deliver the power for those grids. But there's no chance of permitting that amount of transmission lines, so we've got a complete imbalance. There's a 100% Quebec green hydro power line from Quebec down through Maine that's being blocked because of trees, and then you can't get a natural gas pipeline from Pennsylvania up to New Hampshire, and 41% of the people in New Hampshire are burning heating oil. At the time of the Russian invasion of Ukraine, there was 400,000 barrels of oil equivalent of dirty Russian heating oil coming in New England because they can't get clean natural gas, from Pennsylvania. So our ability to permit and build infrastructure is key to our national security, key to our energy security. You guys are on the tip of the spear right now. What are you learning that would be helpful for the whole industry?
Well, we've learned a lot. I would say, depending on where you're at in the Midwest, it's a little bit different. So in Iowa, it's much more ag-based. As you continue to go north, it's still ag, but they get into more energy in North Dakota. So we try to tailor the message to the group that we think obviously benefits from this long term. I was talking to Charlie Gorecki last night, and the opportunity for EOR in North Dakota is huge. We will be operating what we believe is going to be the largest carbon capture project in the world when it becomes operational. And we expect to have around 20 million tons of CO2 capacity per year. And Charlie cited that he believes that North Dakota needs somewhere in the ballpark of 200 million tons of CO2 per year for EOR down the road, which I think is going to be a huge opportunity, but it's the next stage. Obviously, the more near term is the ag community and what it does to decarbonize liquid fuels. But to the folks on the left that have concerns, I get back to the fundamentals. And if we do have concerns in this country about abating CO2, I think we have to get to the fundamentals of what does it cost to get a ton of CO2 captured and underground. And for us, like I said, we're $30 to $50 a ton. Most of the studies you hear on electric vehicles in terms of the subsidy per ton is, $1,000 to $2,000 a ton. So we're orders of magnitude cheaper, and we will be putting a meaningful amount of carbon that otherwise would have been emitted underground. So I think the message is different depending on where you're at, but we continue to learn and listen and alleviate concerns where we can.
Vicki, Chris, you just want to build off of what Justin was saying on some of those challenges?
Well, I think the challenge for us and for our industry is to have a unified message around this. And I think we all up here do, and we all see the benefit of what we're each trying to do in different ways, but it's going to require leaders in our country to step up, and leaders that are credible, and leaders that understand how important this is for the United States. And I would say that we don't have that happening on a large scale yet. We have support from some, like yourself, but there's got to be a groundswell of more support that can influence. And even some of the organizations like Environmental Defense Fund, they've been helpful in a lot of ways, on a lot of things. I don't think they're quite there yet on understanding the CO2 capture and EOR, but I think they're studying it. And if they study it and they get to the point where they're ready to support it, that's a big voice. That would be a big voice of support for us. And so we're working on those kinds of agencies and organizations that could help.
For me, a couple data points. One is more technical, and it's really related to how do we move more quickly with the whole CCUS industry.